each individual in this room has had a say in funding and the work in this space. And I'd like to just have an open comment about the difficulty in ensuring that these investments are well placed and well made. What are the difficulties in making investments in this, in enteric methane mitigation currently?
I will answer that by saying there's way too many unanswered questions. There's too many places where the funding could go, right? And we also understand that there are federal mechanisms of funding and there are also private mechanisms of funding. In our case, in the Greener Cattle Initiative, we're working in the middle. It's a public-private partnership, right? And so you're actually trying to fill in the hole of what's not going to be picked up by the government, by the federal arm, and what's not going to be picked up by private industry. We have not talked about private industry funding, which it's huge, and we haven't even talked about the amount of research that, for example, gets conducted here in the U.S., but also this is something that happens in other countries. In our case, in the U.S., by the USDA ARS, which is the government's research arm. So the reality of the matter is that in order to better make decisions, it's important to try to understand what's going on in other areas, and they're challenging to understand.
One challenge I would just mention is there's a real impatience for people wanting the solution yesterday. And like we know in the work we've been doing that there's an awful lot of very fundamental questions that really should be funded and answered before you're going to have those solutions that are really sustainable. And Sarah mentioned it earlier with respect to the kind of one compound that's like the one that's closest to being really a solution in some systems. And that was a very mechanistic approach. It was deep science, knowing exactly what they're looking for, went after it, found it, tested. It's difficult to make the case to fund that kind of work. We are trying to do that with our particular initiative and fund a lot of that stuff that just others won't touch. But that'll still be a conversation to have. So I think that's a challenge, like patience and funders being prepared to like invest in things that are just not sexy and not solutions tomorrow, but just really have to be done. Because I think otherwise it's just the same old spinning wheel. We kind of, throw it and say no, throw it and say no, throw it and say no. Don't have a mechanistic understanding ever. And it's sort of, decade goes on and we're still in the same place. So we're trying to change that a little bit. Maybe just one other comment would be, and it's maybe not exactly the question, but I think we have to have science being undertaken and capacity built in low and middle income countries to be part of this research activity. And I know there are many, many priorities today that are beyond like direct methane mitigation, but it's a question of time. And we kind of have to start building the capability on the sort of science that Matthias and Spencer are doing here at Latin America, Africa, South Asia, Asia. And there are people with some great capability, but as a system, no. And there's a lot of investment to go in the infrastructure and the labs and things to do that kind of work, because at some point it's going to be needed in those places to validate the things we're currently researching in a few geographies, right? The wealthier countries.
Yeah, perhaps I could add to that. I hear the urgency. I mean, I actually got an email from one of our shareholders this morning saying, when will farmers have these things? Like, because we put out our quarterly report saying what progress we're making, and that there was enormous pressure out there, certainly in the sector that we're working with in New Zealand, to get things to farmers. Which does bring me to the regulatory framework question. I'd love to see some consistency in the regulatory framework, and the regulators, I know you will talk together if you're somewhere in your room, try and work on a framework where you can get approvals that can be then, make it relatively easy to get approvals in other places once you get them in key approval markets. Because there's enormous cost to the regulatory framework at the moment. And I know it's early, these tools are very early, so I understand, having headed the Ministry for Primary Industries in New Zealand, which is the regulator, you've got to be very careful with this, but at least working together across the regulators would be helpful.
I have just a small note because you guys covered really well. But on the regulatory, it's actually even difficult to get a food use authorization here in the U.S. We are seeing us sometimes with money, and you award your recipients, and they cannot start the work because they cannot get a food use authorization. So I think that's also a point to bring.
Thank you. And Juan, you mentioned private capital. We're seeing a very large increase in private capital, but private capital was really some of the first money in the door to get some of the early trials kicked off in this space. And so we're starting to see the increase in public funding and philanthropic funding to work in there. But what role does private capital play? What can it play in roles like the public-private partnerships, but beyond that, in helping get the public research developed?
The challenge there is that there is research that needs to be conducted at the pre-competitive level, and then there's research that needs to be conducted at the competitive level, and it's difficult to identify clearly where that boundary actually lies. I think that a lot of the companies, many of the people here in the audience that are trying to put products out in the marketplace could probably identify certain basic questions like, minimum dose, what's the active ingredient? I mean, we're beyond the shotgun approach, right? Which is, I believe, it was said before, okay? But we're beyond the shotgun approach. So some of that, I believe, is something that could be done at the pre-competitive level. Every single one of those companies will have to put their packages together on their product, because there's no other way in which those are going to get registered. They're going to get authorized. You can't just expect to obtain authorization because your product is the same as the other product. That's not how it works. Okay, so it's challenging, but because the companies will have to do that work in order to get their products into the marketplace, the question is, are there specific research questions that could be answered in a pre-competitive manner to put everybody at a good spot from which to compete from there?
So if we want to engage private industry in some of this pre-competitive work, how do we go about in organizing it in a fashion and communicating what work actually needs to be done for them to engage on, for them to help fund, that can move the entire field forward, large sections of work, whether that be different classifications of interactions and modalities for different feed additives or other interventions? How do we communicate that work to the people who have the capital required to fund it?
I'm just going to jump in there. I'm gonna do something. Well, it's not unheard of. I'm actually going to call out here our New Zealand friend, because I was impressed with the bromoform workshop that they conducted in New Zealand. Okay, it was a bit painful because I had to stay up until really late, because I didn't fly out to New Zealand. I participated virtually, but I thought they did a great job at identifying certain basic elements of information related to bromoform that is required by everybody. And they put it, together in a report. I think we need more of that type of open discussion. I'm gonna go one step further. I am going to say that I know that some of you were there because I saw you there. There was an ADSA Discover conference 2 weeks ago outside of Chicago on data sharing. It was about how does, and it was not just on enteric methane, it was on everything. It was like dairy farmers and dairy farms collect bazillions amounts of data, right? How can all of these data be actually used for the benefit of everybody, right? And it wasn't an easy conversation. It was a very difficult conversation. Sharing data is not easy. You know, there's a lot of elements that came up, but those are the types of discussions that need to happen, in my opinion, because without that open dialogue, you know, you're not gonna have the trust that you need. You're not gonna build the relationships. You're not gonna build the trust that you need to eventually identify the common ground, that common understanding that I was referring, that allows you to build from.
Thank you for that. We held an earlier workshop on regulatory framework as well. So we're going to keep doing those kind of workshops, and we'll increasingly invite people internationally to join them where there is a shared challenge and try and bring thinking together. And we are half private capital funded, so it was a private sector idea that it was a private sector that got together and went and has a big obligation as well, actually, under the Paris Agreement. So they said, well, why don't we pitch in as well? But yeah, I think the opportunities like this are a great chance to hear other people's perspectives, and out of these, maybe we hear of some other things that we could collectively work on. Not all of us, obviously, but you know, a lot of the people here.
In the last, I guess the last part of this, and we can release everybody, so we can you can corner everyone here, bring them a beer, and then you can ask them your own questions. And it's really about how do we make sure that the efforts that are happening internationally are really that collaborative? How do we make sure that when New Zealand has a workshop on bromoform, that Juan and FDA and people from the EU and EFSA are involved in that, so we're all having the same conversations as these move forward?
I mean, well, we have to talk and keep talking and make people aware of these things, right? Have that sort of mentality that it's better that we behave in that way than hold things, I guess. How? I mean, I guess there's lots of different ways, and I don't know. I mean, we, from our vantage point, with our limited influence on things, I mean, what we're trying to do is at least where we have some means to influence the direction of travel of work, you know, projects funded, connect them, modify the design of them with additional resource, etc. Like connecting as much as we possibly can. That's a goal we have. That's part of it. Open, and it's going to be much more open once we get our strategy and our funders like approving that. But it's one piece of the puzzle, and then there are many actors that have to kind of do similar things and other things, I guess. It's, don't know. I was going to say something earlier on the other question about the private sector funding as well, because I sort of, we have, and I should acknowledge, the private sector funder of this initiative, the accelerator, the only current one putting funding into the pre-competitive pooled fund is Danone, and we should acknowledge that commitment. But they took a very kind of rational business decision to do that, right? It's not sort of a sustainability play, it's actually a core business play. And it took some time for that decision to happen and for things to move, but it meant that when they took the decision, it's the right people in the conversation from the right part of the organisation. It's those people actually with the extension teams milk sourcing in developed and developing regions who have to deliver on their 30% reduction by 2030. And their selfish interest in being part of that is that they, like ministers and governments and stuff, get the newspaper and it's like the latest claim of the latest solution, and they don't understand, and they think, oh, companies, okay? And the staff are the same as the ministry staff. They have to respond to the stuff all the time. And for them, it was very clear that being part of a collaborative that attempts to be kind of finger on the pulse a bit of where things are really at and cut through the BS that's out there, they saw huge value in that as one thing. And then being able to scale the resources, like their resources plus the rest means impact, right? Even if they're a large company, there's still benefit to them in having a joined up effort. So that was part of that communication with them as well, and making the case, and we hope others will follow suit. So that's not not to answer your last question, but it's maybe for the previous one.
With that, if we could all thank our panelists, and I want to thank everyone here today for making it through. Thank you very much.